Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christiansen. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it. Hey, Dr. C here with you. So I wanted to get another angle on the soy discussion, just so you could see, what else was observed by those who've looked through the medical literature without a real bias or agenda and just seen what the sum total of knowledge is. And that's the thing. We can always find reason for concern, but it's never the speculation or the possible risk or harm. It's really, what do we see from the human studies? What's actually happened to real people? And what does the consensus of evidence show us? Not the one or two outlier studies. So for this, I was really happy to have a professor of public health from the Stockton University. This is Anthony Disson. Anthony's a great guy. I had a blast talking to him. He's got a very deep background as a nutritionist and as a professor of public health. He's active in many nonprofits in the cancer world related to breast cancer and others. And he's just a real scholar of all things about plants and their impact on human health and quite a bit on soy. I learned a lot from this discussion and hope you enjoy this like I did. I give you Anthony Disson. Hey, Dr. Alan Christiansen here with you, and I'm super jazzed to be joined with Anthony Disson. Hey, Anthony, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you. I'm really excited about this. So, yeah, let's dive into soy. You want to do it?
Always. I'm always happy to talk about soy.
I came across a paper just talking about soy coming under fire, a lot of misinformation, and very well written and very scientific, well referenced. And when I reached out to the author saying my interest in talking about thyroid especially, he connected me with you, looked at your background, and I think this is going to be great. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm very honored to be able to speak about this because it's funny. I talk about soy almost more than I think I talk about most other things. So it's a perfect,
really?
Soy foods, it's fascinating, has sort of become the lightning rod for so many different people and sort of organizations out there as portraying it either as a miracle food that will cure everything or as the prolific poison that's killing us all. So it's this amazing spectrum.
So, it's funny, but early on, my first work, I was saying how I saw no relevance between soy affecting thyroid health. And then somewhere along the way, all my friends were so against it. I figured, well, there's got to be something there. And I figured, well, there's no harm in avoiding it. So I'm not proud of the fact that I just kind of went along with the trend and I never really campaigned against it, but I would just throw it in the list of things to avoid. And then several years back, some friends showed me data arguing about possible health benefits. I'm like, shoot, if people are avoiding this unnecessarily, it's not just a neutral decision. They may be missing out on some possible benefits. So I dug deeper and realized that, what we're often hearing in the health space is just not what the data tells us.
Yes, and it's interesting that you would say that because I've seen the exact same kind of thing where it's this message that just starts to get out there where all of a sudden people who I had never heard speak about soy foods before just had all these opinions about this one particular food. And when you really dive into it, you realize so little of it is based on actual information or evidence or published data. And it starts to become more what I call social media speak, where it's just sort of someone posts something and then it goes viral. And then all of a sudden, even healthcare professionals start to share this information as fact, when really it's quite the opposite. It's literally just people's opinions about something being shared, but it's amazing how quickly it catches fire.
And that's a great point you bring up. And this is something I keep trying to explain and impress upon people is that with the huge diversity of data we have about, all the biochemical pathways, all these huge amounts of data done on in vivo test tube studies looking at various topics, you could make a theory for almost anything, and you could have a really plausible theory. It could make a lot of sense, but the body is often just not intuitive. Things just don't play out the way we think they would.
That's exactly right. It's amazing how much we ignore the fact that taking an extract of one food, and putting it in a laboratory setting is not exactly the same as a human or an animal or anybody else eating this food with the complexity of all the other nutritional value of not just that food itself, but then how it interacts with everything else they're eating, and then all the other environmental influences of their lifestyle, of their movement. And you can create a published study that shows, that an extract from broccoli kills cancer cells. And I'm sure you can also set it up to show that broccoli worsens health because of how you kind of manipulate these chemical compounds that you're extracting from foods. And I think that leads to a lot of the confusion around what constitutes a healthful diet, because there really, if you look at the literature, isn't a lot of confusion. But as you just said, if we kind of nitpick these little bits and pieces from food and we study them in a laboratory setting versus in an actual organism, it can create a whole lot of question marks.
Where do you feel things started to go badly with soy? Is there a certain time frame or certain messages that you think kicked a lot of it off? Or
what I have found, and this is by no means anything, again, just this is as much information as I've been able to gather, and very admittedly blended in with some of my own just opinion there. So I'll put that out. But what I've noticed with soy is, for whatever reason, soy foods have become sort of the synonymous food associated with more plant-based diets, with less animal-based foods in the diet. And I think that has led to organizations, whether that is special interest groups for food industry, or whether that's certain organizations that exist in the world that are advocating for these very high fat, high animal food based kinds of diets, where soy has just sort of become this association with the denial, or with the reduction, or with the avoidance of these animal-based foods. And so there's a number of organizations I can think of, and sort of health philosophies out there that come to mind, that really advocate a high animal food diet. And I think almost by default, they then demonize soy food, because especially when plant-based nutrition was starting to be talked about more, and a diet for a small planet was published and all these things, with the then belief, and unfortunately still exists a bit today, that only soy food would give someone on a vegan, vegetarian, or plant-based diet a complete protein, that therefore soy food kind of became associated with these more plant-based diets. And even though people who eat lots of animal foods could eat soy too if they wanted. And so as people started, I think, to argue about whether we should be eating a high animal food diet or a low animal food diet, or avoiding animal foods altogether, soy foods always kind of became, I think, this beacon of, if you eat soy, you're absolutely eating a plant-based diet. And so therefore, if you wanted to tell someone not to eat a plant-based diet, you had to make soy seem like a deleterious, damaging food. Exactly right. Because otherwise you weren't going to ever go back to your animal foods. You were just going to eat your body weight in soybeans all day.
Got it. It's kind of funny, in the political world, we have all these bellwether issues. And so often our stance on these issues become almost just, badges of tribal identity. If you know someone's views, and I'm not putting any views out, I'm not getting political, but if you know someone's views on something like gun control, their views on climate change. And those two things have nothing to do with each other than the fact that the tribal badges line up in certain ways. So it sounds like soy could be almost like that.
I think that's I couldn't agree more. I think that's perfect. It becomes the beacon of just this whole other area. And so if you're pro soy, then you're anti this. And so I think if you're an organization or a provider, or anybody who's saying, no, you should eat a lot of this, then automatically you have to cut soy out, or although it just kind of gets lost in the swarm of it all, which is very fascinating. And what I usually say to people with that is, well, even if you are eating a high animal food diet, I hate to break it to you, you're probably eating a high soy food diet too, because what do you think they're feeding the hogs and all these other things? That's where most of the soybeans in the Americans, at least in the United States, that's grown, it's used to make animal feed. So I always find that kind of interesting.
That's a funny thing. So can you expand on that a bit? So if someone is avoiding soy food and consuming a lot of animal food, they're not avoiding soy food. They're getting it just in a more concentrated form.
Would that be accurate?
Right. And people will think about grass-fed or wild game, but there's very few things that are really wild or totally grass-fed. The bulk of that's going to be grass-finished. Am I correct? Or?
That is exactly. I mean, the way that most, at least in the United States, agriculture is yeah, they'll be fed either a corn or corn and soy diet most of their life, but then finish with hay and grass, which it can be helpful with reducing E. coli content in the GI tract of these animals. So it leads to certain, at least food safety benefits, but again, the message that's given is, oh yeah, this animal's been eating nothing but grass and bugs its whole life. But yeah, that's very rarely the case. It's usually just because of the quantity of animals that are being raised for livestock in the U.S. We don't have enough open land for them all to graze on grass. So the only way, if you're trying to keep this system going, is you have to feed them a lot of corn and soy, just because then you can feed them in a much more concentrated space, and it's more cheap because these are subsidized crops. And yeah, they'll give them the last couple days or couple weeks of their life with some grass or things like that, and then it gets sold as grass fed.
So Anthony, you're saying my steak and salad's made out of corn? That's fighting words.
I think Michael Pollan says it best, where most of the food in our grocery store is just cleverly redesigned corn.
Wow. So there was concerns early along about soy relative to infant formula. I think that some of the ideas come from that. Are those points you've been familiar with, or?
Yes, and it's interesting because infant formula, I mean, not to get too off subject, but even infant formula has a very fascinating history of, we always assume we've got it figured out. So, a lot of early infant formulas were really awful in terms of they were basically just maybe some oil and wheat starch and water mixed together. So, as the technologies around these things have gotten better, for infants that for various reasons or may not be able to have access to breast milk, well, the soy-based ones are the newest ones on the market. So just like those early infant formulas being pretty poor, as the cow milk-based infant formulas got better and then soy came on, it also had some catching up to do. So earlier soy-based infant formulas, may have either been too high in protein. A lot of people don't realize how low in protein breast milk is. And so,
wow.
These soy-based ones, because soy is so rich in protein, may have been too high or may not have been as nutritionally complete. They have gotten better, though, as our understanding of what the benefits of breast milk are, of trying to mimic that as much as possible in these infant formulas. And so for children that are being raised on formula, for better or worse, for those who either can't tolerate the cow's milk protein or whose parents are raising their children as vegan or vegetarian or just don't want them to use the cow's milk formula, these soy ones are available, and they're much better now than they used to be.
I looked at some data on this, and yeah, the early ones, all proteins have some effect on binding with minerals. And like you said, the cow's milk formulas had a bit more time to get established, and they worked out, the fact that a lot of iron was bound up by casein, you had to put more iron in to compensate, but they weren't clear in the earliest soy iterations how much iodine was bound up by soy protein.
Yeah.
And so a lot of those first versions, these infants had no other nutrient intake, and they could have become iodine and selenium deficient just because of the different differential binding natures. But yeah, the later versions, they just had calibrated, and that was just a non-issue.
Exactly. And that's kind of the issue that still remains with soy food, is sort of this fear that it's this goitrogenic food. And again, it really isn't quite as extreme as that. But yeah, early understanding of these mildly goitrogenic properties of soy, were just unknown. And so as science is such a fascinating thing, is we like to pretend it's this beautiful arrival to knowledge, but really what it is it tends to be, at least in healthcare, a lot of us hurting a lot of people until we figure out what we were doing wrong, and then we kind of start to get a little bit better at it.
So you've looked a lot at soy and thyroid. Just what are some things you found?
So with soy and thyroid, the concern really is not so much that soy has a negative impact on the health of our thyroid gland, but that when someone is consuming soy food and is also experiencing mild to moderate iodine deficiency, the soy food, because of just the nature of how it operates within the body as it digests and some of these unique characteristics to soybeans can exacerbate the effects of iodine deficiency, and that's what can lead to some of these goitrogenic properties where we have lower thyroid hormone synthesis, which increases the TSH, which can lead to some of those goiters or thyroid impairment over time.
And this is the most bizarre thing that always surprises people, but iodine is, I've called it the Goldilocks mineral. We need not too much, not too little. And areas that have severe iodine deficiency, then we'll see more goiters present. Just like you said, the thyroid's working really hard. It's pumping on empty and it starts to swell. And the paradox, though, is that in areas that have mild iodine deficiency, we have still a slight elevation in pediatric goiter, but no elevation in adult goiter. And we have the lowest rates of autoimmune thyroid disease. So areas that don't have iodine deficiency, they're just normal, not even excessive, but just normal. They have much higher rates of autoimmune thyroid disease than areas that are mildly iodine deficient. And many have argued that as an adult, some exposure to these dietary goitrogens may be a positive thing for the risk of autoimmune thyroid disease.
Yes, absolutely. It's sort of, that whole hormesis idea of a little bit of stress to the body. I mean, and this is being looked at a lot right now, especially in like longevity studies in medicine of what is it that seems to be associated with less disease and greater number of healthy years. And these small exposures to the naturally occurring, with a lowercase t, toxic materials in some of these plant foods is part of the reason why people who eat so many of them, or at least is theorized as to be part of the reason why people who eat so many of them maybe are living longer with less disease, because it is a very mild, healthy, manageable stress to the body that forces it to stay, vigilant. And it does seem to be associated with, especially with autoimmune diseases. It's incredible the research that's being done on all forms of these small types of stress that we can put ourselves under, what it does to reduce our risk for autoimmune conditions.
In the data that you're talking about, just like the data about overall plant intake and plant diversity being correlated with positive health outcomes, there's pretty much nothing more robust in the nutritional literature than that. I mean, that's just a pretty well-established conclusion.
Yes, it's one of the things that I speak to people quite a lot about is, science is not ever meant to be groundbreaking. It makes for a great, headline, but it's supposed to be the accumulation of data over decades and decades that we finally start to get some consensus. And, it is the preponderance of the data absolutely shows that people who eat the greatest amount of their food, of their calories from whole or minimally processed plant-based foods have all of these benefits. Now, the reasoning for that is always the fascinating part. And I don't know if we'll ever fully understand why, because there are all these things. It's the hormetic effects of some of these naturally occurring plant toxins combined with, maybe is there a microbiome benefit to these diversities of fiber and all these other things that come together that are associated with better health. And so soy food, again, it is just one of a number of types of plants that we can consume that as part of an overall a diverse diet rich in a lot of other foods can be quite protective against disease and degeneration over time. I think the only concern that is present with soy is the same concern I would say is present with any food, where anything in excess is excess. And there are cases of people severely harming themselves from eating too much bok choy and too much mustard green and too much kale.
Wow.
But not because they were eating what I would call, healthy, normal amounts. They were eating, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cups of these foods a week in this purposeful desire to, eat as many bites of this as they could. And there are compounds in these cruciferous vegetables that in excess are damaging. And so I think, again, it's funny, no one out there is worried they're getting too many flax seeds or too many servings of kale, even though those too have been found to have mild goitrogenic properties. But again, I think they just haven't been given this same aura that soy has been given of, you got to be careful, you got to be careful.
So there's cases you're describing that's fascinating. And an odd thing too is that, you can never really change one variable of your diet. Those folks were eating a whole lot of one thing, but they were also, sounds like, eating nothing of anything else.
Exactly. There's not a lot of room left in your day or in your stomach to eat other foods. And so, yeah, now you have this excessive amount of one particular food and its unique nutrient and chemical composition coming in that isn't being introduced into an environment, with other types of foods or other sorts of things. And so all these factors come together and they can lead to harm. And so is there an excessive amount of soy somebody could take in? Absolutely. Just like there's an excessive amount of any food. But in what I would think of as normal culinary preparations of soy-based foods, only if someone were saying, I want to eat as much soy as I can possibly stand every single day of the week, only then I think could they lead to some health issues, not because soy is poisonous, but because anything in that type of excessive quantity is going to have some problems.
Yeah, but red meat is different. I'm not sure if you followed the carnivore diet news lately.
Oh, sure. Oh, mercy. I know. I don't know why, but we just as a people are so drawn to that kind of message of I can eat all the bloody red meat I want and it'll only make me healthier, as opposed to thinking, well, that can't even if I'm not trying to eat an exclusively plant-based diet, that cannot possibly be true.
So I'm really curious. So it was bok choy and mustard greens, you said. Now, were these separate things, or the same person had both of those, or what happened? It was a fascinating story.
Well, one of the things they share in common is, so in addition to soy foods, flax seeds and then cruciferous vegetables have also, again, been shown to have this, kind of mildly goitrogenic effect. And in studies that have been done, in cases that have been done to see, well, how much would someone have to eat of these different foods before it would have a clinically significant impact on their thyroid function? They look to see, well, a person could theoretically eat so much kale or so much mustard green, etc., to see these levels. And certain foods were found to be more concerning than others. And there was one particular case study of a woman who did die, but she was found to have eaten something like 1,000 cups of bok choy in a very short period of time that led to her, being brought to the ICU and then dying as a result of basically, bok choy poisoning. But that doesn't mean.
And it was the naturally occurring insecticides there was a toxic effect, or what was the mechanism of action they thought? Or
the thought in terms of the mechanism of action actually was the effect of it on her thyroid function.
Wow.
But again, it was something like she was juicing them and she was blending them, and all she was eating was this bok choy. The reason why, I don't know. I don't know if someone said, bok choy is really good for cancer prevention, and she thought, well, if I eat as much of it as I can, I'll be okay. But it was something that went beyond what could ever be expected to be a normal way of eating. That it was something that was being purposely done. I'll send you the study. I think you'd find it interesting.
Please, I'm fascinated. It's kind of a bizarre thing, but in the past, before we had our current understanding of thyroid disease, there would be occasional cases of mixed edema coma. In the absence of thyroid hormone, the body can build up fluid. There was a case report a few years ago, a horribly unfortunate situation of a woman that had a total thyroidectomy, and for whatever reason, was not on thyroid replacement therapy. And she came into an emergency room in a state of severe mixed edema. She was functioning, but it surprised me how long someone could go without any. So that case sounds curious. There actually was, I've had people ask about the same goitrogenic thing too, and practiced for so many years. There was a case in which a young man was brought into me by his father, and he had abnormal, his neck was enlarged. It was obviously visible goiter. And his father thought that this young man's extreme diet was part of that, wanted him to see someone like me rather than, he was afraid that the boy would just be put on unnecessary long-term treatment. And, he did have abnormal signs of thyroid function without yet signs of autoimmunity. And he had gone to a motivational speaker and gotten very gung-ho on just raw vegetables.
Sure.
And over the course of the last several months, his diet was comprised of almost exclusively blended raw broccoli, a couple pounds per day.
Yeah.
And there was almost nothing else he was consuming for nutrition.
Exactly.
And not even like a speck of iodized salt along the way or anything else. So yeah, it's possible, but in the big scheme of things, the risk of that happening by adding in these foods to your diet is exactly zero.
Exactly. These are the cases we see. And in that case in particular that you just shared, it shows that also this is why, again, sometimes these in vitro studies are so confusing is, well, a lot of the goitrogenic properties of most of these foods are dramatically reduced, if not completely deactivated, while they're cooked. So, not that it would still be a healthy approach to eating, but even if you had eaten that same quantity of broccoli, but in a cooked form,
Sure.
it would have still most likely been quite damaging to his health just due to the mono exclusivity of the diet he was eating, but at least the goitrogenic property would have been different. So again, even with some of these foods and soy foods, it's just the nature of how we eat them and prepare them and cook them also tends to make them much less of a concern to our health and these sorts of things. And again, especially if we are eating an appropriate amount of iodine, yes, not excessive, but also not deficient, any of these concerns seem to disappear pretty quickly.
Other concerns that come up, many ask about just the GMO issues with soy, and any thoughts about that?
Well, again, that's what's kind of interesting about soy is the majority of the genetically modified soy, at least in the United States, is, again, it's produced for animal feed. So if someone is concerned about GMO soy, the thing that is really going to be the primary source of that in their diet is sort of the middleman approach in the way that they're being exposed to the soy, which is through eating a livestock that's been raised on this GMO soy. Now, yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I know. I was with human consumption of soy foods. These types of soybeans are much less likely to be GM. Although, if someone wanted to be especially avoidant of GM soy, then if they're able to purchase their soy foods organically, that are, again, if it's produced in the U.S., at least as it currently exists, U.S. organic regulation does not allow for GM products to be used in organic products.
I was going to say, whenever I see things in the health food store or pick things up, like I'll see tofu or tempeh or whatnot, and I don't know, it seems like almost all the versions I see are saying they're organic, they're non-GMO, and
yeah, human exposure right now, at least, to GM soy is pretty limited. I am much more likely to be exposed to it, and then the residual, the pesticides and these glyphosates that are, at least as of right now, the one thing we know for sure is a real concern of these foods. That's what's going into the animal feed.
So I'd like to also just mention about some possible benefits, some action steps, but any other just soy thyroid thoughts that you've had or points that you had in mind? Or
the only other one or two things I wanted to share were, in looking at what is kind of considered, well, what would be sort of for lack of a better word, normal consumption of soy food. If we look at countries and cultures that are, pretty regular soy consumers, it's usually somewhere around 2 to 3 servings a day, and that can be every single day. Which, again, if we were to think about this in a I always love this word, but kind of a normal consumption, well, that's how much most people would eat, even if they were choosing to eat soy foods every day. It would be very difficult to eat more than that. I would have to eat something like a block of tofu every single solitary day of the week. And then in addition to that, eat more soy food to get beyond, 4 or 5 servings a day. So only if I was, to some of these early examples, like eating a block of tofu at every meal or drinking a quart of soy milk at every meal, something just excessive, only then could I possibly be in a situation where I'm being exposed to so much of the naturally occurring kind of compounds in soy that in that sort of concentrated dose could, in theory, impact my health if I was also at the same time dealing with some suboptimal exposure to iodine. So again, someone would have to really try hard to eat enough soy where it would have any possible negative impact on their health. And then the only other thing I wanted to share with iodine was a lot of people are looking for sea vegetables as a good source of iodine. Especially if they're eating less salt, and or if the salt they're using isn't iodized. But I just wanted to share that while certain sea veggies are a great source and a healthy, appropriate source of iodine, like dulse and nori, certain sea vegetables like kelp, and especially one particular one called hijiki, is so high in iodine that it could actually lead to some thyroid issues when consumed regularly. So just to be kind of thoughtful of where, if you're using sea vegetables as a source of iodine, nori or dulse are much safer ways to go about it.
Dude, that's awesome stuff. I'll have to send you a copy of the next book when it comes out. It's all about the iodine story.
Oh, great.
There was an assay done just a little bit ago. Some researchers they pulled a list of, I think it was 117 of the most popular multivitamins, some prescription, some over the counter, and they randomly chose 60 of them, and they assayed them to compare the labeled iodine content from the actual iodine content. And of the 60, exactly 0 contained even close to the labeled iodine content. And it was not better prescription versus non-prescription, but one big thing they saw, they would either have iodine, there was a few exceptions, but almost all had iodine either from kelp or from just potassium iodide. And the potassium iodide still wasn't perfect, but the kelp was all over the place. There were products that were labeled for 150 that had like 600 micrograms of iodine. So it was just a mess.
Absolutely. Oh, that's fascinating. I don't doubt it for a second, especially with the supplements. There's just such a spectrum of quality with how so many of these supplements are made. And yeah, they can have wildly different levels of all these different minerals and vitamins they contain. That's fascinating.
And back to your point about how modeling how you could overconsume, for example, if you were doing that block of tofu and that quart of soy milk per meal, the idea I was saying about how you can't change one variable. Mm-hmm. So one of two things would happen in that context of your diet. Either you still ate another variety of foods to balance that out, in which case you would eat way too much, and that's a big variable by itself, or you would eat nothing else, in which case, you're back. There's the over soy, but there's also the mono diet problem.
Exactly. Yeah, so it doesn't take, I think for anybody, if they just kind of take a moment to kind of think about it logically that way, they can see that there's really no concern. But, most of us get our health information that are shared in sort of this, very dramatized, frightening kind of fear-based model way where it just makes it seem like if I eat one more edamame pod, I'll just die. I do a lot of work with women who are either going through treatment for breast cancer or post-treatment for breast cancer. And there's one particular group I've been working with for almost 10 years, and I don't know if I've had a single interaction with them in this last decade where at least one person didn't express concerns about soy. So it keeps coming up and it keeps coming up. So it just needs to sort of be reinforced again and again and again that it is not a food of any concern.
Specifically, what would have been your findings relative to it and breast cancer?
Well, if the Canadian, there's a lot of studies in Canada that have looked at this, kind of showing benefits of not just soy in of itself for reducing the risk of breast cancer and especially reducing the risk of recurrence of breast cancer, but for women that are also choosing to utilize things like tamoxifen and other kinds of treatments, they found that the incorporation of soy foods in their diet while on these treatments actually enhanced the benefit of the treatment while minimizing the side effects. And so, with soy, and again, I think this is another reason to your earlier question, why soy has this history of fear around it. It's quite unfortunate that we call these compounds in soy phytoestrogens because it makes it seem much more frightening than it is, because I remind people all the time, plants do not produce animal hormones. I mean, right? We're two completely different, species. What the hormones and the chemicals that are produced by a plant are not, the bioidentical kind of ones going through an animal. So we call them phytoestrogens, these compounds in soy, but they are not estrogen at all. The benefit, though, is their chemical structure is just similar to estrogen enough that it is able to connect to those cell receptors. And I'll give you my really awful analogy for this that I've got to think. But the way I always describe it to people is these phytoestrogens are like people who go to coffee shops but never order anything, and they just sit there on their laptop and they work all day. That's soy. All it does is take up space. It doesn't create any, quote, cellular activity.
I love that.
If I could think of a better one, I will, but it's the one I've been using forever. And the most important thing is they're then blocking paying customers, which would be the animal estrogen, from coming in and ordering anything because they're taking up all the space in the coffee shop. So the worst that soy does for breast cancer is nothing. It's just, at worst, it has no protective benefits. But really, again, if we look at the preponderance of the data, it shows that women and men too, as a lot of times men forget, they also can be at risk for estrogen receptive positive forms of cancers and health conditions. That these chemicals are tremendously protective against initial diagnosis, or if I've already been diagnosed, they can be very helpful for my healing and my prevention of recurrence over time.
So I love the analogy. Maybe we can talk offline and figure out another level to one also, because the other part of it too is that there's soy and the phytoestrogenic effect blocking certain receptors, but we've got different types of receptors, and some we want blocked and some we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got those in the endometrial tissue or the breast tissue, the alpha receptors that are nice to have inactivated, but we've got others in the brain and in the connective tissue and in the bones that we'd love to have activated. And that's the bizarre thing. It's like they call it a diphasic response. In some way, these phytoestrogens plug up the stuff you want plugged up, but then help the stuff you want helped. Yeah, and that's been the paradox.
Beautiful. I mean, it really shows our symbiotic, relationship with our development over our history with these foods, of how, our exposure and our consumption of these foods is part of the reason why we're all alive and here today. I say this to my university students all the time. Sometimes it boggles my mind any of us are alive right now. Like, how did we as a species, before we had the technologies to protect ourselves from the elements and germs and all, how did we do it? And it really shows how we have evolved and grown over time, so in concert with these foods, and especially these plant-based foods, that it almost strikes me as, I don't know what, but this very strange thing then when these messages come out that we must remove ourselves from these foods that have been such a part of our survival over our history, that, psychologically I kind of like, what does that mean when now we're kind of turning our backs on these things that have helped us get to this point?
And I love the point too about just the phytoestrogens being not animal estrogens, and also that they're not innate to soy. A lot of our favorite plant foods are very rich in these compounds.
Absolutely. Chickpeas have phytoestrogens, flax seeds have phytoestrogens, but there's not an anti-chickpea group out there. It's always soy. So it really speaks to, the more of the, the political aspects of where the
psychological.
Exactly. More than anything that has to do with health. So yes, it's soy just got the mark of Cain on it for some reason, but it's just because soy, I think, became the association food as opposed to anything that's unique to this food itself.
So I'd love to have you expand on some of the possible benefits. And I guess what hit me is that, my demographic that has the most rates of thyroid disease, we're looking at perimenopausal, menopausal women. These are demographics to where some of these benefits are really relevant to them.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, what's so beneficial about soy, and especially in this particular age group and this kind of demographic group, is soy food. This isn't unique to just soy, but the way their amino acid structure and kind of content is made up of is that they're able to walk that fine line of providing a wonderful source of amino acids for growth, for continued kind of maintenance and growth and development, without being so excessive, especially without being excessive in certain amino acids that have been associated with advanced biological aging, kind of hastening our tissue degeneration over time. So certain amino acids like methionine and leucine, which are present in soy, but not at the levels that are seen in a lot of animal-based sources of protein. Methionine and leucine, I won't say restriction, but just less of those amino acids in the diet are associated with less functioning of certain pathways in our body, like PKA and mTOR, that seem to age us faster. So especially in sort of a menopausal, perimenopausal time of life where our body is no longer growing, it's more about maintaining and softening loss of function over time. Well, if I have to pick a protein source, soy is going to be, like all plant proteins, is going to be especially protective of maintaining my biological youthfulness and my health, and not accelerating my movement through aging as much as a lot of these more animal-based sources might be, partly because they are so rich in certain amino acids that just seem to drive these metabolic pathways more quickly.
So we think about possible effects of aging and things we've seen from some chemical analysis, but human studies and outcome studies, other things that you've seen as far as just possible benefits by including them, or?
Well, in addition to that, one of the fun things about soy-based foods is, especially again as we're kind of moving through our lifespan, is as far as legumes go and as far as plant-based foods go, they're a little bit richer in certain types of fatty acids that can help with a nutrient absorption as we age. So, as we go through our lifespan and sometimes our digestive system starts to not function quite as strong, that can lead to some of the mineral in particular, but certain vitamin deficiencies over time, which may not necessarily be because somebody isn't eating those nutrients, but they're just not being absorbed as efficiently as they once were. The little bit of a higher natural fat content of these soy foods does help with nutrient absorption and bioavailability of these nutrients. So that can be one protective benefit. Again, soy foods are rich in some of these antioxidants and these other types of phytochemicals that seem to have some very specific disease-fighting, health-maintaining properties that aren't found in abundance in a lot of other foods. And there's even some research right now in the world of how food and cancer relate, that soy appears to have quite a strong anti-angiogenic property, which means it can help prevent tumors from developing their own blood supplies. So especially as we go through our lifespan and as autopsy studies show, most women will get these microscopic tumors in their breast, and most men have these microscopic tumors in their prostate. Most of us have these microscopic tumors in our thyroid. But if they never get their own blood supply, they don't actually lead to disease. And soy food, the isoflavones and these other compounds within the soy seem to help prevent the formation of those blood vessels, which can help keep my reproductive tissues and my thyroid tissue healthy. Because if those microscopic tumors never grow, well, then I never will develop a disease or a health condition as a result.
If you wouldn't mind going a little deeper on one of those recent points, the idea I've heard before about one of the concerns of soy was the antinutrients and the phytic acid, which I really found the phytic acid to be a non-issue in general. Mm-hmm. But you're saying there's good evidence saying that soy can improve absorption. Which nutrients, what mechanisms you're referring to? Or?
So there's a couple things there. So so actually to address what you just said, so certain plant foods have phytic acids within them, which certain whole grains possess, and certain legumes like soy possess, which even today in dietetic education discussion, there's a lot of concern that, these are, they're anti-nutrients, they'll block your absorption. But again, when looked at actual human studies with this, where you give someone some soy food and then you measure, basically their stool afterwards to see, mineral loss and things like that, it is a non-issue. It does not lead to any kind of significant decrease, because one of the amazing things of our body is our small intestines in particular are able to adjust its absorption of minerals and other nutrients based on its abundance. So if I eat some soy, and technically, it contains some phytic acid, which might in theory inhibit absorption, well, then my small intestines just increase their permeability, their bioavailability for those minerals, and it comes out in the wash. So one of the things is, even though they contain these phytic acids, yes, the body adjusts around them. And in fact, going back to the idea of cancer, certain health conditions like cancer seem to be lower in people, perhaps due to the phytic acid content, that there might actually be some anti-cancer benefits to phytic acids. But then the other thing is, as we are trying to minimize our exposure to unhealthful or heavily processed sources of dietary fat, we still do need a certain amount of dietary fat within our daily consumption of food, because there are certain vitamins, kind of the classic ones being vitamins A, D, E, and K. But there are other nutrients that we take in through food that are called fat soluble, which means to be as bioavailable as possible, they need to be digested and absorbed in the presence of some fat. And a lot of times when people think fat, they think oil or they think butter, they think of an extracted fat, but oats contain fat. And technically, there's a teeny tiny little bit of fat in a banana. It's not a lot, but it's there. It's These
Yeah.
things are present in foods, but soy-based foods, as far as legumes go, are a little bit higher in these fats than if I compared them to a lentil or something like that. And so perhaps another reason why these foods in the diet can be so beneficial is they're introducing a little bit extra unextracted fat into my diet to help with the absorption of minerals and vitamins and things that need that fat to be bioavailable, that I might otherwise not have. And especially as I go through my lifespan and perhaps my digestive system needs a little extra help, that little bit of extra presence of some natural fats like what's found in soy may help compensate for any loss of absorption that my intestines may be experiencing over time.
I loved how you mentioned unextracted. There's concerns that when fats are extracted, there's more risk for oxidation and, buildup of free radicals. I want to back up to one comment real quick because I'm thinking about my listeners, and I know some of them just could have had a chance of having their heads explode when you talked about increasing permeability as being a good thing. Can you expand upon that?
So, and when it comes to the checks and the balances of at least nutrient absorption, when we're talking about that, is our body is very tightly, or at least attempts to be very tightly controlled of not absorbing too much of a particular mineral and not absorbing too little. Although this is true of other nutrients as well. So if I took something like calcium, for example, and I took a great big calcium supplement, that's such a bolus dose, such a heavy dose of calcium all at once, that my intestines will actually will actually reduce how much calcium they will absorb at that moment, so as to not have as much of a flood of calcium coming out into my bloodstream, which can cause some problems. And so with these phytic acids, again, if I look at them in a petri dish, technically, yes, they will bind to things like zinc and they'll bind to things like iron. And the thought is then this will lead to anemia and mineral deficiency, so we better stay away from these phytic acids. But when I digest food, and especially, again, cooking tends to dramatically reduce the phytic acid content of food, or at least its ability to bind nutrients. But then once it gets into my small intestine, well, then my small intestines will be able to increase the ease at which, increase the absorption of these minerals to compensate for any remaining binding that might be going on with these phytic acids. So it's not that it then leads to an excessive intake or an obsessive absorption of these minerals, but it keeps it right at that homeostatic range, not too much, not too little, right at that little Goldilocks zone, like you said earlier, of compensating for some of these naturally occurring chelators, some of these naturally occurring binders.
And we have some enzymatic adaptations too, things like carrier proteins as well, metallothionein. We adjust that based upon our needs overall. And
yes, our body is delightfully smart. We can trust that it can compensate for these things. And I think the greatest concern that I've always had in my profession and in nutritional sciences is we're such a fearful we're so deficiency focused, I think is what I'm trying to say is, in 100 years ago, when a major cause of death was, tuberculosis, and our environment was so different, I could see then, yes, there was concerns that people may not get enough food because of spoilage or because of poverty and things like that. But we are in a state now where we're suffering more from diseases of nutritional excess, but our discussion around nutrition and nutritional research hasn't quite caught up with that yet.
Something I just thought of, I think would be awesome is let's just talk through what you would think. Let's say you've got a magic wand and you're the diet czar somehow. and let's talk us through someone on a plant-based diet and someone on a mixed omnivore diet. Let's do the plant-based one first. Just like what types and what amounts and what frequencies of soy food you think would be ideal.
What I would say is if for someone that's choosing to eat a very plant-based diet or plant-exclusive diet, whatever their choices may be for that, daily consumption of soy would absolutely be fine. I would say the research I've come across really seems to find a sweet spot is somewhere between 2 to 3 servings a day to get a lot of these health benefits we've talked about with the soy without coming anywhere close to what would be considered an excessive or an abnormal intake of soy. So 2-3 servings a day, even every single day of the week, would be fine. I think especially as with people following plant-based diets, the fear that I have come across with people I've worked with or people I know is they focus too much on restriction. I'm following a plant-based diet and I'm trying to lose weight, and I'm trying to do this or that. And, one of the great benefits of plant foods is they're full of fiber. And fiber, again, helps to actually decrease our absorption of certain things that can, again, be part of the reason why they're so beneficial. But if I'm eating a plant-based diet and I'm not taking in enough food during the day, or I'm kind of purposely restricting my food intake to an excessive amount, that can lead to some deficiency, not because plant-based diets are inherently deficient, but because I need to make sure I'm eating enough whole food. And this is, fruits and vegetables and grains and legumes are not the foods we need to be limiting. So I would encourage people to eat so they're comfortably full, and, to not limit their consumption of food, at least not in the beginning. And that if they choose to use soy, if they're bringing it into 1, even 2 meals a day, or serving, or 2 or 3 servings a day, then they're going to be fine.
What are some examples of your favorite types that would be included that way?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I have to say I'm a real big tofu fan. I actually like it more than tempeh. I know some people like tempeh more, but I love tofu because I just like it as a quick base for things. I actually use it more in like sweet foods or dessert kind of preparations more so than savory. So I usually use it to make like a pudding, just because if I need something smooth and kind of creamy, but also that takes 2 minutes to make, I can throw some tofu and some dates and some cocoa powder or cacao or whatever in my Vitamix and zip it up real quick and kind of have something that's it's dense and it's viscous, so it's very filling, and it just is a kind of quick way to get something sweet. So that's kind of my favorite preparation of it.
That sounds really good.
I highly recommend.
I've used it in some ways. One thing, when I do use it savory, I'm sure you're aware of this and you've done this, but I love to press it out beforehand. Like I'll put weights and like some kitchen towels and then do a marinade with it. Like just push out some of the water and then pull in some flavors and then use it in a stir fry or in a saute.
Absolutely. My favorite thing is to make like a peanut sauce, where I'll take some natural peanut butter and a little tamari and some garlic and some lime, and I'll blend that up and I'll let it soak in there, and then either grill that or bake it or saute it, and just kind of get like a satay feel to it, which is, and if someone is allergic to peanuts or can't, almond butter or tahini or whatever, there's sort of, a nut or seed butter of choice would be, it absorbs it beautifully. So very much agreed.
So how about the mixed diet, the more omnivore diet? How would you see that fit inside of it?
What I would then say to someone who's saying, I'm not interested in abstaining from or taking, animal-based foods out of my diet, but how do I still use soy in an appropriate way? What I would say is, can you use some of these soy foods in conjunction with these animal foods you're taking in? Because to me, that would do 2 benefits. One of which is it might reduce the total amount of animal, meat or whatever that's being used in a recipe or in a meal, because part of that volume would be replaced by the tofu or the tempeh or the edamame or, whatever kind of soy food might be used. But then the other thing we know is that if for people that are consuming animal-based foods, especially regularly, if they can consume them in the presence of a decent amount of plant-based foods, it helps to reduce some of the inflammatory response in the body to that, so that if I'm going to say, no, I'm eating a burger, I'm eating beef or steak right now, okay, but can you combine it with a lot of plant food, so that at least you're getting the fiber you need to digest, you're getting some of the antioxidants you need to handle some of the possible pro-inflammatory qualities of that food. And with the soy, it'll help introduce, again, some of those, phytoestrogens and those phytochemicals that can be protective and might negate some of the long-term consequences of such a heavy animal-based food diet over time. So I would at least ask them to incorporate it in anytime they are eating meat, to make sure they're also getting some soy, or if not soy, then some other type of plant food in there at the same time, to minimize some possible inflammatory effects that way.
I think I've seen some of that same data you're referring to, and I'm at my family. We're not vegan, and when we'll cook up burgers, I usually will take some cooked black beans and just get some finely chopped mushrooms and stir all that together, and season it, and then make patties, and everyone loves it. And if my son has friends over, no one notices, or it's all fine.
Exactly. It's funny. I say this to people frequently. Often people are envious of the non-animal based meal option, if for no other reason than it's something different. And
Yeah.
I think there is something really beneficial to patterns in diet, because it helps our eating be easy, and it's something we don't have to think about too much. But how many people have eaten a million burgers in their life, and a mushroom black bean burger, and that it smells different, it looks different. It's just, I think it can't help but attract, like, oh yeah, I guess there is more than one way to eat at a cookout. I think it excites people. They got some options.
One last thing just thought of too. I've seen mixed data about the relevance of the fermented versus non-fermented soy, and I've seen some recent data arguing that it's really even a non-issue.
Oh,
what are your thoughts that way?
we are. I'm so happy you said that, because I just thought to myself, oh, I forgot to talk about the fermentation thing.
Awesome.
Yes, and no. So to answer your question, yes, the most recent data we have shows that the fermentation, it truly doesn't matter. And for people that may not know what we're talking about, you can have unfermented soy, which would be like edamame and soy milk and tofu, or soy food that has been fermented, which would be tempeh and tamare and miso paste and natto, and the thought was, well, maybe this fermentation process, again, negates some of the goitrogenic or the anti-nutrient aspects of the soy, or it somehow makes it more digestible. And the most recent data that's out really shows that no, that whether you're eating it unfermented in the form of soy milk, or you're eating it fermented in the form of natto, it does not change the impact of that soy's benefits, or reduce these possible negative aspects one way or the other. And in fact, there was one study I came across that showed that for men, at least, for prostate cancer protection, the unfermented soy, so the soy milk and the tofu and the edamame, was actually more protective against prostate cancer risk than the fermented soy, like the tempeh and the natto.
Wow.
So there might even be properties in soy that are lost during fermentation that might be of a special benefit to certain people for certain health needs. But yes, it's funny, the same organizations that are anti-soy, for whatever reason, that is always the one caveat, is they'll say, but okay, if you're going to eat soy, at least let it be fermented. And
just don't inhale.
I've always thought that was interesting. Like, okay, well, why? Why is it that fermentation takes a little fire out of their concern? But absolutely, the data has been very specific recently to show that it truly is not better or worse to have it fermented versus non-fermented.
This is a quick recap, mostly for your interest. But a few years back, I just dug so deep on all the literature I could find on thyroid disease, and I reached out to all my online health expert friends in the thyroid space, and I said, "Hey, just tell me the literature. I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything, and send me the studies saying that this is bad for the thyroid. And I've got really no bias right now. I'm trying to sort this out." And a lot of things were just, not really human studies. They were easy just to not pay attention to. There were plenty of human outcome studies showing no effect. And actually, the most recent meta-analysis was published this year, and they saw that, no effect. There could be a TSH change of 0.15 to 0.2 units, international units per mil, which they found to be of no clinical significance, but no change on symptoms or T3, T4 scores or antibody scores. And that was a meta-analysis of about 40 different recent studies. So, but the three studies that I couldn't explain away, or three categories, I should say, first off, one was the whole soy formula with iodine, but again, that was dated. Once they updated the calibration, it became a non-issue. Then there was one study which I can't dismiss, but I also can't explain, in which they observed that siblings, Julie and Joe are brother and sister, and Julie was given soy infant formula. Well, Joe had a higher rate of autoimmune thyroid disease. Joe wasn't. Made no sense whatsoever. There was no proposed mechanism of action. It wasn't that Joe didn't consume it. Julie did. Yeah. and it was not reproduced by other studies, but it's there. So that one exists.
Interesting.
And the third one was a larger study looking at subclinical hypothyroidism. And the headline was soy intake caused a higher rate of lapse from subclinical hypothyroidism to overt hypothyroidism. So I dug deep and read the full paper, and there was 2 groups of people, all had subclinical hypothyroidism, and all were on soy diets, and all were on soy isoflavone supplements too. I forgot to mention that. One group was on a higher dose of isoflavones than the other, and the higher dose of isoflavones did have a higher rate of converting to overt hypothyroidism than the lower group of isoflavones did. But the big wrinkle was they failed to contrast what the baseline rate of expected conversion was and how that compared to these 2 groups. You know, those that have subclinical disease are known to have a set lapse rate into overt disease. It's just expected. And when I crunched the numbers, the conversion rate for the high isoflavone group was higher than baseline, but the conversion rate for the soy diet and low isoflavone group was actually lower than the baseline rate of conversion. So that one came out to be a non-issue as well.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything you described there kind of just to me it reinforces why it is so important to actually read the paper and dive into it. That so many people, they get their health information via the news or via, again, social media posts, which are, if beyond all the other concerns, it's not the full story, and you do need to sit down and read it and to possess the literacy to know how to read a scientific paper. And it's a hard thing from a public health perspective. I think a lot of people, they're looking for good information, but they need to make sure they're talking to people who are doing exactly what you just described there, which is not just going by the headline, but actually reading the whole thing and seeing if it makes sense. And it just, to me, further emphasizes the need for healthcare providers and healthcare professionals that are doing exactly what you're doing right there, which is taking the time, reading, not just kind of sharing these kind of incendiary, quick sound bits that make for really great clicks and make for a lot of views, but aren't really sharing a lot of info.
Well, this has been a blast. I've really enjoyed the time with you. And any closing words you got for our audience? I
would think that my closing kind of comment right there is, whether it's soy food or not, just to know that diets that are richer and more heavily based on all of these types of plant-based foods are associated with wellness. So it doesn't have to be a soy-based diet. It doesn't have to be a soy avoidant diet. It's just, if I'm bringing soy food in and it is just like every other ingredient of food that I'm eating, or it's not being consumed to an excessive level of quantity, it's just there, it can only help. It can. There's no concern of harm, whether it's soy or whether it's bok choy or all these things. It's, if I'm eating it and I'm basing my foods around it and it's being incorporated in sort of normal human consumption amounts, it can only be a benefit.
That's awesome. Anthony Disson, thank you so much. So those of you listening, Anthony is a professor. So he's someone who doesn't just play an expert on TV. He really is one. And a lot of his time is spent in the academic world. But he does go through cycles where he will do some direct consults nutritionally for people, remote. He does do some events. You can find more at anthonydisson.com, DISSEN. We'll get the link on our show notes too. But yeah, lots more fun things there. And Dr. C here with you. Thanks for your time. And this was a really fun episode, and look forward to seeing you really soon. Bye-bye. Hey, Dr. Christiansen here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christiansen on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.